Hi everyone, I'm Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. My guests today are Samantha Wellank and Maxine Bennett. They're co-owners of Banff Canmore Ghost Walks. I'll be talking with them about many of the haunted sites they go to on their ghost tours. Samantha and Maxine, welcome to Paranormal Yacker.
Thanks for having us. Great to be here.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Great. When one mentions the resort town of Banff, which is located in the province of Alberta and is within Banff National Park, part of the Rocky Mountains, and is Canada's first national park, what comes to mind for most people, I'm sure, is that it's a top go-to destination for skiing. That
Most
Banff
definitely.
is also home to a lot of paranormal activity, is probably not as well known. However, it does, and that, of course, is what we'll be yakking about in this interview. In addition to Banff, you also offer Ghost Walks Canmore, which is located just outside Banff. What is that city known for?
Up until the 1970s, Canmore was a coal town, basically just mining and being sort of next to the national park. And then when the mines closed, the town went through a period of a little bit of a recession and then a bit of a reinvention. And now we are the place where people stay if they can't get into Banff. Banff also has a cap on how big they're able to grow because they are in a national park. So for ecological preservation, they can't get any larger footprint-wise than they are right now. So in Canmore, you get the folks who basically can't fit into the town of Banff a lot of the time already, or you also get the people who just really like the vibe of Canmore, which is a little bit calmer, a little bit quieter than Banff, and a little bit more of a family town than a tourist town.
Yeah, we have an unofficial curfew of 9:30
Yeah, you
in
can
this
see
town.
it's basically bachelor parties on the street after that and nothing else.
Everyone else is in bed and they're ready to wake up early in the morning to hit the mountains or go on
summit a
whatever
peak.
Summit. Lots of active people here, that's for sure.
Lots of Olympians.
We do have the Nordic Center here where the biathlon athletes train mostly.
It's where part of the 1988 Olympics happened. So
we're known for that. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. We're getting a history lesson here too, which is great. The Banff Springs Hotel is probably the most famous haunted site in Banff. Stories abound of the ghost of a bride from the 1920s who walks its halls. Can you tell me the backstory on the ghost bride and how and why she haunts the hotel?
Yeah, for sure. So the story goes is that in the 1920s, there was a young bride descending a grand staircase. We could get you the prints, not the prints, like the digital copies of these illustrations as well for the video. But essentially, in the 1920s, there was a young bride descending a staircase at the base of the Great Hall located within the Banff Springs. And during that time frame, they obviously didn't have the miracle of LED candles for decoration, for ambiance and decor. So they would actually take physical wax candles and put them on each individual step of the great staircase. And they would light it for not only a source of light, but again, for ambiance for a wedding day. And moments after she is wed to her beloved fiance, she's descending the staircase in order to get to the Rob Roy dining hall, which is at the base of that staircase itself. And there's actually two different versions of this story. So the first version is that as she was descending the staircase, the long, elegant train of her dress caught fire. And in that panic of having her dress go up in flames and trying to put it out, she essentially falls down the steps. Now, another version is that there was no flame involved. She simply tripped on her own dress or over her own feet and essentially fell down the staircase. Regardless of which version you get the beginning of, the ending is essentially the same. She unfortunately falls down the complete set of stairs and snapping her neck at the base, dying instantly on her wedding day. Now, from there, I've been told by former Banff Springs staff that they've converted that staircase area into a library. And then eventually it was like a staff only area, like a staff pass through. And then it wasn't until like the early 2000s that they reopened the staircase to allow guests to use it for day-to-day uses. And from that point, that is when guests and staff alike were starting to see the apparition of this ghostly figure somewhere on the staircase. Now, we've had reports of people seeing a dark shadow dart down that staircase. Others who are either walking up or down the stairs, doesn't really matter the direction, but essentially they will feel the thin filament of bridal lace pass through the peripheral of their vision and even like touch them as if the bride is just wisping past them. Now, it's said that in the lower level bathroom, that if you focus hard enough on one of the mirrors, she'll actually appear to you with flamed candles around her and the ghostly image in the mirror.
She's probably our most famous ghost because she's the only ghost we talk about who has her very own coin and postage stamp from the Royal Canadian Mint and from Canada Post. Kind of a big deal. And you can see the flaming candles behind her in the picture there as well. It's rather beautiful.
The mine manager's house, built in 1907, is still standing at what once was a vibrant coal mine site, but now it has long been abandoned, and the area is a literal ghost town. Could you tell me something about the history of the house, the town it was built in, and what paranormal activity has taken place there?
Oh, the Canmore mine manager's house. I hate to tell you, it's not so much a ghost town over there anymore. The neighborhood's been revitalized and renovated, and
You're going to put a housing development on it.
It's probably one of the fancier parts of town now because the houses are pretty big. But there was a period, this is my favorite story.
Yeah, you pick it.
The mine manager's house is one of my favorite stories because it's a story that involves some, let's say, fun local hijinks going on. After the mine closed down, when the house was empty for a while, it ended up being a place where teenagers would go to party. And you'd have a keg, you'd have a bunch of friends, which is probably honestly safer than what they do now, which is go out in the woods. But the mine manager's house, they started having an interesting thing happen at the parties there. The teenagers would be standing around in a circle and they'd move to let somebody into the circle. And a few minutes later, they'd realize that nobody actually joined them. And there's just an empty spot. And this happened often enough that it becomes a running joke of, oh, you got to let the ghost in the circle. And then, of course, they start consciously doing it and being like, come on in, join us. And then they up the ante. They start cracking a beer and leaving it there for the ghost. You being like, come on, man, this one's for you. And then suddenly, when they start cracking the beer and inviting the ghost in, accidents and injuries at these parties go way down. It becomes much safer. And they're like, oh, my God, there is a ghost. So they really commit to being able to, you can talk to the ghost if you need to. You can make sure the ghost is there. The ghost is your friend. Things really come to a head. Halloween 1994, there was a big party at the house. A local band was playing, the Electric Squirrels, still a thing today. They are awesome. And the Electric Squirrels have finished up their gig. They're getting ready to go. They've got their coats from upstairs, and they're waiting for one last band member to come down the staircase. And the rest of them are down at the bottom. They see him come up to the top of the stairs. He's a little, iffy on his feet at this point in the night. And at the top of the staircase, he trips and he falls forward. And he starts to fall, but he freezes midair. And this is where his memory pauses. He freezes midair, and his friends say that he rights himself and floats all the way down to the bottom of the stairs to be placed gently on the ground at the bottom, which is where his memory restarts. So for him, it's, I tripped, I'm fine. For his friends, they're like, oh my God, dude, you just flew. That was awesome. And from that point, unfortunately, a little bit after that, the mine manager's house, fortunately, the mine manager's house ended up being sold, renovated. It is now a private home again, so we don't have the big teen parties there anymore. When it was under construction, I've heard from one of the contractors who worked on it that in half of the attic, if they went across to that half, all their power tools would die. And when they came back, they would all start working again on the other half of the attic, which is the reason we think we know who the ghost is. One of the mine managers who lived in that house had a son who was unfortunately, he had what at the time they called melancholia. And these days we call clinical depression. Not great supports in that time period, a little bit more of a buck up, Sonny, you'll be fine mindset, which doesn't help. And unfortunately, also being the son of the mine manager, the other kids in town whose dads work for his dad don't want to be his friend. So he's really alone. And in addition to his clinical depression, this mounts on each other and he ends up hanging himself in the attic. We think actually that his story is the reason why he helped out so much at those parties, is because for the first time he had friends, for the first time he's being included, for the first time he's part of the local teenage group. And so, of course, he's going to look out for his friends. He's going to make sure they don't get hurt because they look out for him. Nobody else really had before that. We don't know if anything's still happening in the house today. What I've heard through the grapevine is that it's calmed right down. So I really hope that he's been able to move on at this point. And it is a private home, so we have to tell people to not, approach or go looking for him.
The Canmore Opera House in Spring Creek is said to be haunted by a male ghost who resides there. It has also been said that if one sits in a certain seat in a certain row, they will have some kind of paranormal experience. Can you elaborate on those paranormal happenings at the Opera House?
So the Canmore Opera House was first known to be the band hall because it was built by some of the original miners that were found here in town. We believe that the band hall was built by these gentlemen here as a place where they can play their instruments, throw lavish parties, charity events, and just play music for everybody as a way to blow off steam after a long day of working in dark, dingy coal mines.
Mm-hmm.
Now, 5 years after that, it was rebranded as the Opera House. And then in 1915, it turned into a cinema. Now, while it was the Opera House, it was the first log cabin in the world. So we had Ginger Rogers and Jack Benny.
First log cabin opera house.
Yes, first log cabin opera house. So Ginger Rogers and Jack Benny actually came all the way to little old Canmore to experience it for themselves. They were very famous at the time, very famous silver screen actors and actresses. And so that was a big deal for the Opera House. Now, where the hauntings generate from, we believe, is one of the original miners that built the Opera House, or the band hall, I should say. At the turn of the century, there was a devastating accident in one of the local mines. And as a result, I believe 9 miners died and countless others were injured. The Opera House, being the largest building in the property or in the town, was converted into a field hospital, a morgue, and a funeral home all in one go. So that gives a lot of paranormal, energy behind that. Mm-hmm. And along with the love of music, would also help to act as like a tether for this particular spirit. Now, we don't know exactly which one it could be, but it could be any one of those gentlemen. We do have a description. He is the only spirit that we have like a full-on description of. He is said to be like a middle-aged man with a long mustache, a very defined mustache, wearing a white collarless shirt, brown tweed jacket, tucked into high black pants and high boots. And he's seen here in Canmore, and he's also seen in the original Opera House that was moved to Calgary Heritage Park in the 1960s. So the building that we have here in Canmore is a reproduction, but that building does have one original log from that building. So we believe that that is what's kind of calling that spirit in between properties. So he's a well-traveled ghost, we'll say. We're not entirely sure why he likes that specific seat. I think maybe it's the view. But guests and performers will never see him physically walk to the chair. He just kind of materializes in it. And it's to the point where they've had to put like a reserved seat sign, because if you sit in his chair, he gets very upset. And we've had a young woman tell us that she had her bag completely emptied off of her lap because she had just sat down and put her purse on it, kind of thing. And then we also had a gentleman who was sitting in the chair. He had gone out to get a glass of wine, during intermission, came back, sat in his seat, was about to take a swig of his drink when the whole glass went down his friend. Yes. So those are just a few examples of why you should not sit in a reserved seat because you never know who it's for.
Alberta Provincial Highway 40 and Beaver Street are both included in your tours. What can you tell me about the paranormal activity that has taken place on those roadways?
I'll take Highway 40 if you take Beaver Street.
I will take Beaver Street.
Excellent.
Totally
All
fine.
right. Highway 40 has a couple things that have happened along it. One of them, classic ghost. We have a ghostly hitchhiker who appears reasonably far down Highway 40, deep into Kananaskis. He will hitchhike by the side of the road. He's a tall young man in black clothes with long black hair. He's got this huge black dog with him. He's been spotted hitchhiking in the same spot since the 1970s. And people who pick him up have reported that he'll say that his friend's car is broken down, that he needs to get to a phone, and he'll just keep refusing to get out at each payphone you get to. There's still no cell service in that area, so we still do have payphones, so his ruse still works, but he will just keep refusing to get out when you get to the next payphone and go, oh, can I go a little further? Can I go a little further? And the people who've taken him the absolute furthest is about 40 kilometers up the highway, up to Mount Kidd RV Park. They let him out in the middle of a huge empty parking lot. And in the space of a blink, he and his dog had completely disappeared. There's no way anyone could have run that fast and hid in an empty parking lot. So that made them very aware that he was not quite human. Something like that happens most of the time that people let him out just by the side of the road. He'll just be gone. And he shows up again in the same place. We don't know who he is or where he's going, but you don't have to feel any obligation to pick him up. It's okay. And there's another one a little bit further up the highway. This was a very specific little time period. He doesn't appear anymore. But in the early 80s, there was a young man who was working at the Kananaskis Village. He was a line cook there. And he was Australian. We had a lot of Australian and Kiwi and English folks here in the valley who come here for the ski seasons and to work in the area. But it had been a particularly cold year. So a lot of folks had been taking off back to warmer climates, not quite ready for a bunch of minus 30 and minus 40 temperatures. This young man had been there several years. He knew how to handle the cold. He wasn't going to take off. But when he didn't show up for work for a couple days and his bosses went to investigate and his roommate said, I don't know, man, he took a bag, then his bosses wrote it off as he went back to Australia. His friends are saying, no, he wouldn't do that. You got to believe us. But his bosses aren't listening to that. And a couple weeks later, his friends start seeing him walking down the side of the highway. Anytime one of them sees him, they'll pull over and get out and he's gone. Eventually, they start comparing stories. They realize they're all seeing him in the same place. Finally, about 2 months after anyone's seen him, they finally decide that they're going to ignore what their managers say. They're going to report him missing. So there's a search that happens on that section of highway. People in a big line spread out, head up into the trees. And only about 200 meters into the trees, they come across a small makeshift campsite and they find his body. He's been dead about 2 months at this point. After this, his body is collected, he's sent back to his family in Australia, and he is never seen on the side of the highway again. So that is a ghost who had a job, and he got his job done.
Dead Man's Flats is on the itinerary of your ghost walks. Just saying the name Dead Man's Flats can conjure up all sorts of spooky visions in one's mind. How did it get that name, and what paranormal activity has been reported there?
I should say there are a couple stories for Dead Man's Flats. The settler story of why it got its name on the tour.
In the 1800s, there was a gentleman, late 1800s, I should specify. His name was Jean Morat, and he was living in the south of France. He had a small dairy farm, and he thought life was great. But then he got information that there was plots of land being given up in Alberta, Canada. So he decided, this is going to be my time. I'm going to go all the way there. At the time, Dead Man's Flats, that region was not called Dead Man's Flats, obviously, but it was called Pigeon Mountain Flats. That was the name for that little hamlet, we'll call it. And so he got his plot of land. He got himself situated. He got maybe about a dozen dairy cows, and he thought, this is going to be great. I'm going to start a new life. I'm going to love this. It'll be great. What he did not take into account was that the climate in Pigeon Flats is not the same as the south of France. So with him not planning for this, out of the 12, I think only 3 dairy cows survived that first season. They either died from famine, disease, or the cold. He was not ready for this. And after that first season, he thought to himself, well, I have 2 options. I can either give up everything that I've worked for to this moment and go back home with my tail between my legs, or I can write to my brother, Francois, who is still back home in France. Now, Francois was the older brother, but he was not a very good older brother. He was a very particular person. One of our guests actually described him as a walking red flag and reminded her of an ex-boyfriend. And I can't unsee it. So I'd like to share that with you just to paint a picture of how he was. Very short-tempered, very lazy, did have no work ethic whatsoever. That's the type of person Francois was. So Jean writes him a letter and says, brother, I really need your help. There's this beautiful plot of land. It's going to be great. If you just come across and help me out, it'll be worth all your efforts. He leaves out the climate and all the devastation he's gone through because he wants his brother's help. But for Jean, unfortunately, neither one of these options were great, but I guess getting his brother over was the better of the two. So essentially, once Francois established himself with Jean in Pigeon Mountain Flats, they did not last very long together. They were together for maybe 13 months until they got into a very nasty argument and Jean asked him to leave the property because he wasn't doing anything. Essentially, what Francois did was he pushed all the work onto Jean and he was waiting for the rewards kind of thing, because he had this mentality that he was the older brother and he knew what he was doing. Now, after this, Francois jumps from mine to mine to mine because he gets hired and fired as quickly as he shows up, because that's the type of person that he is. After, I'd say, about a year of this, even leaving the Kovac mine, which is one of the largest mines that we had here, and there's still signage for it, so listeners can check it out to an extent. Can't really see the full thing because it is, at the end of the day, a mine, but it's there and it's cool. Now, Francois goes back to his brother and he confronts Jean and he says, I'm the older brother. This should be mine. And like, you have no rights to it. And they got into a really bad argument to the point where Francois takes a hatchet that was just lying next to them and bludgeons his brother to death. From that point, he buries him out in the cow pasture. And that very night sleeps in his brother's bed because he thinks to himself, this is now my land. And anybody who asks, where did Jean go? I'll just let them know that he couldn't hack it and he went back to France. Now, that night, he's woken up to the sound of wood chopping out in his yard. He gets up, runs to the wood area or the station there because he's thinking to himself, there is no way that Jean survived what I did to him. When he gets there, the hatchet is still lying where he left it, clean and unmoving, but he could still hear the wood chopping. Now, after a solid week of this, waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of wood chopping, he gets quite emotional because he thinks to himself, he starts to feel that guilt of maybe I shouldn't have killed my brother. So he goes out into the pasture, digs up his brother's body, throws it into the Bow River, thinking, if I just get rid of the body, I'll get rid of my guilt. Now, some time passes and Jean's body floats all the way down towards Calgary, where the local Northwest Mountain Police Detachment finds Jean pretty intact because it's cold water, it does preserve a body to an extent. And everybody knew what Jean looked like because he had made a name for himself at some point in his journey out here. And they immediately go back to the farm and they confront Francois, where he quickly lets them know and confesses that he had murdered his brother. Now, the sad part of this story is that Francois never really went to prison for the murder, he ended up going into a psychiatric facility because they found out that he had schizophrenia and the voices in his head were telling him to murder his brother. So that is the unfortunate story, the settler's version of how Dead Man's Flats got its name.
Have tourists on your ghost walks ever reported having a paranormal experience at any of the sites they visited with you? If they did, could you tell me about some of them?
Oh, I'll take this one. Out of the two of us, I have to put it out there. I'm a believer in the paranormal. Maxine is not.
I want to.
She wants
I want to so bad. I keep putting myself in situations where something paranormal can happen and nothing. And as soon as something does, I will absolutely believe in it. I'm like, come on.
Yeah.
I want it so much.
I have the opposite, which is good for everybody else. Maybe not so good for my sanity at the end of it, but I'll take one for the team because I really love what I'm doing. I've had guests tell me that they've seen childlike apparitions at a certain place. Well, it was on Beaver Street, actually. You talked about Highway 40, but we actually never got back to Beaver Street. This reminded me of that. Beaver Street has a lot of heritage homes. Now, we don't know all the ins and outs of like who's passed and what events have happened, but for some reason, Beaver Street, there is one location specifically that is one that gives for me. It's the Luxton Home. It is a museum. It's run by the Luxton Foundation. It's a literal time capsule of when the Luxton family lived in this home, which I think gives it the energy to welcome the spirits of like that family or someone who's familiar with that family to come back to it. It's kind of like a beacon of like normality for them. This house in particular, I have had 3 different people tell me that they've seen the apparition of a little girl either in the window or they've been approached by her. I had one young woman tell me she felt that her hand was grabbed as if it was from a child. And more recently, as in like end of October this year, I had quite a large group of people. I think it was over 20, which was odd for me. But this one group, I think there were like 10 people in themselves. And one of the members had come to this location. I had just stopped to put my lantern down and I hear him call out, "Oh, they're here." And I look at him and I think he's probably talking about his friends who he had lost in the kind of like the scramble of getting between location to location. And as soon as I was done the tour, he came up to me and he said, "I know that you heard me, but that I wasn't looking for my friends. I felt a little girl like tug on the back of my jacket. And I could see also when we were approaching the building, she was waiting for us at the window." So that's when I said, "They're here." So he knew that I was going to talk about the little girl. We've also had people tell me that they've seen like dark figures walking behind me. So some of the locations I will not put my back to because fool me once and all that. Yeah, we've had some interesting things. I even had one gentleman throw up. That was interesting. He was of the impression that a spirit was trying to jump him, in his words, and he just got so kind of pent up that he threw up. He actually broke the one of few rules we have on the tour, which is no throwing up because I'm a sympathetic puker. If I hear it, see it, or smell it, I will throw up. And if I do that, it's the end of the tour. But he broke that rule. That was one of the more intense tours I've had. And that was a private tour with just 2 people.
Yeah, I mean, I think almost all of our guides have had something happen except me. Yay.
Yeah.
Like Mike's had somebody knock on the other side of a door in an empty house.
Yeah.
Pam has had creatures grab her. I don't know if Jen's had things happen. But
No.
the only things I've had are when you get mediums on the tour, which happens a lot. We
Yeah,
have a
mediums.
lot of people who can talk to the dead come on the tour. And a lot of them will come up and tell you what was happening around you afterwards. So I've had those on my tour, but I've never actually seen any of it because I don't think I'm able.
My next question was going to be addressed to the 2 of you, but considering what you said, Maxine, I'm directing it to Samantha about paranormal experiences you yourself have had.
I've had quite a few. Growing up, I do share this story a lot because I feel like it resonates with people from large families. I spent a lot of time when I was younger in my grandmother's home. She had a small townhouse located in Mississauga, Ontario. That's where I was born and raised, and I spent a lot of time there. I was the youngest of 9 grandchildren by a lot. And unfortunately, in the history of that home, my grandfather passed away as a result. I believe I was around 5 when he passed. And my cousins would think it was funny to tell me, like, Grandpa's still here. He's still watching. And I'd say, yeah, I know, because he's still turning the lights off, and he will open cabinet doors for me if I'm looking for like a specific cup. When you're a child, you're like, I really want to be like a grown up, have a special cup. He would open the cabinet if I was looking for it, and the cup would be there. The best thing he did, best as in like the creepiest thing, was he would change the channel to the TV all the time. And this is before the bubble TVs in the 90s. I'm aging myself here, but my grandparents had like an older TV from like, I'd say circa late 70s, early 80s, wood vinyl, the whole bit. He would manipulate that TV all the time. And he would change it to, depending on what time of day it would be either for Mr. Dress Up or The Price is Right. So if I was homesick from school, that's what he would do. Once we changed the TV, sadly, he was not able to manipulate it. But my grandmother did report up until the time that she moved out that he would constantly turn off the lights in the house because he never liked wasting lights. But outside of that, I worked at a small restaurant. It was located in Brampton, Ontario. It was a family-run establishment. It was my cousins on my dad's side of the family. And when I first worked there, they told me, like, just so you know, the place is haunted. And I was like, okay, cool. What does the ghost do? He's like, he does everything. My first encounter, I can't remember what we called him. I think they used to call him Enrique. I don't know why. They call the ghost Enrique. And that's probably what angered him to do all these things. It was 2:00 in the morning. The restaurant, it was about 40 seats, very, very small. And they had like patterned concrete as the floor base. And patterned concrete has a very distinctive sound when a metal chair leg is being dragged across it. So it's pitch black out in the restaurant. All the light that's coming through is through the food pass. And I'm closing up, and all of a sudden I just hear a chair being pulled out of place. And I look at the line cook. It's just the two of us. We had locked the front door. I triple checked it. And I looked at him and I said, what do you think did that? And he's like, oh, it's totally Enrique. I'm like, no. So I turn the light on. Does not one of the chairs get pulled out from a table and face the pass as if he took a seat to watch us close the kitchen? I have like shivers just thinking about this. The next time I had an encounter, I think it was like a month later, we had a hand sink right in front, like just as you're about to go into the pass area, there was a hand sink. He had turned both the faucets on full blast to the point where water was gushing out of the hand sink. And I had to be the one to go out into the darkness to turn the faucets off. That was almost the last straw. But the last straw was I actually got my hair pulled, and that sent me. I thought, I'm done. I am done working here. I had gone into the bathroom to restock like the toilet paper, something I did all the time, not even thinking about it. And as I was coming around a corner, I felt like 3 fingers as if someone went like this and scooped my hair at the top and pulled. My head jerked back, and I looked at them and I said, I'm done. This is my last shift here. I'm done. It was Enrique. I told him, like, you need to get a priest or something in here because the activity was pretty wild in there. Glass would break randomly. I don't think that they caught anything on the security cameras, to my knowledge. I can share loads of stories. Like, I've seen a little girl in a hotel that I lived in briefly when I first moved to Canmore. It was a daytime spirit, actually. First one I've seen during the day. I was helping them set up for a wedding. And out of the corner of my eye, I see just a little girl. And it looks like she was wearing like a baby doll dress, and I could see the lace, and I can see her hands like this. And she had like that Kubrick stare where she was like leaning down and looking at me through her eyebrows. And all I saw was like these like gold tendrils, like Her hair was curlier than mine, and she was just standing there in the corner. And the first time I saw it, I thought, I'm not seeing anything. And I continued setting the table. And then again, it happened. And one of the servers looked at me and said, "You saw her, didn't you?" And I said, "Saw who?" And I started playing dumb. They're like, "You saw the little girl. She visits sometimes. And she plays with the pots and pans in the kitchen." And that last experience I've had was in the last year, I want to say. So it's still pretty fresh. I don't know, but I think spirits love me.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to learn about your ghost walks and find out how they can book them, how do you suggest they do that?
The most direct way is going to our website, banffcanmoreghostwalks.ca. We like to keep it very simple. But Sam also does an incredible job of our social media as well.
You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok with the same handles, Banff Canmore Ghost Walks.
Samantha and Maxine, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yacker. I very much enjoyed yakking with both of you. Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Stan.
Thanks for having us. This was great.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallon of Paranormal Yacker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. So that you don't miss any upcoming shows, be sure to subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, just press the subscribe button on your screen.